So I want to talk about a report that was presented to the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly last year. This report was prepared by the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Sanctions, Madame Alena Dohan, went on an official visit to the Republic of Zimbabwe between October 18th to October 28th in 2021. She went on this official visit to examine the impact of unilateral sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights in Zimbabwe and on the people's right to development. Here are some highlights from the report of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Sanctions. She concludes that sanctions, including secondary sanctions and different forms of overcompliance by foreign banks and companies, have had a significant impact on the population and government, exacerbating pre-existing economic and humanitarian challenges. She recommends lifting unilateral sanctions in line with the principles of international law, avoiding de-risking policies and overcompliance in accordance with the due diligence rule, and engaging in meaningful structured discussions on political reform and the rule of law and human rights. However, last year, in December 2022, the US Department of Treasury announced that it had issued new set of sanctions on 2 individuals and 2 entities in the African country of Zimbabwe, and the reason cited was corruption and human rights abuses. Of course, this announcement came just days before the US President, Joe Biden, was due to welcome African leaders and heads of state to the 2022 US-Africa Summit. What is the history and truth around sanctions in Zimbabwe? The Republic of Zimbabwe has been under some sort of sanctions for decades now. So here's where everything starts. The year is 1878. Major European powers meet in Berlin to discuss the division of Africa. This meeting, known as the Berlin Conference, establishes rules for how the Western countries would divide Africa's resources among themselves, at the expense, of course, of African people. One of the most notable examples of this was the conquest of modern-day Zimbabwe by Cecil Rhodes. He named the country after himself and took away over 75% of the land, giving it to small white minority colonizers. The native black Africans were forced to pay high taxes and fees on their own land, creating massive inequality. The white minority settlers became incredibly wealthy, while the native black Zimbabweans became poorer and were forced to work as wage laborers for the white minority. After a century of colonialism, there was a wave of successful independence struggles on the African continent. It became clear that the days of the white minority government in Zimbabwe were numbered. In a last effort to cling to power, the white minority government pressured black liberation fighters to sign the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979. This agreement reserved some parliamentary seats for white people, and instead of returning the stolen land to its rightful owners, the black native Zimbabweans, of course, it set up a market-based system called willing buyer, willing seller. Under this system, the new government of Zimbabwe would have to buy their own land back from white settlers and farmers using foreign currency. The value of the land was to be determined by foreign financial institutions that were owned and influenced by these white settlers. The newly elected Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, tried to adhere to this agreement, and the West called him a hero and a moderate leader. However, for ordinary Zimbabweans, there was slow progress, even after independence. In 1998, it was estimated that about 95% of the economy was owned and controlled by white people or foreign investors. This caused discontent among liberation veterans who had risked their lives so that black Zimbabweans would no longer be tenants on their own land. The veterans began to occupy white-owned farms, demanding reform. In response, Mugabe rolled out land reform measures. In direct response to this policy, the US government issued the first set of sanctions against Zimbabwe, freezing the country's credit. In the next 21 years, the EU, UK, and Canada would follow suit. These events in Zimbabwe's history have had a profound impact on its people and its politics, shaping the country as we know it today. The legacy of colonialism and its aftermath are still felt by many Zimbabweans who continue to fight for their rights and their land. One might ask what the role of the media has been in these very convoluted and complex conversations around sanctions. Instead of reporting the truth and the true nature and the true impact of these sanctions on the daily lives of ordinary Zimbabwean people, instead, the Western media in particular has continued to demonize the country. In my view, the United States of America, the European Union, Canada, and the United Kingdom have repeatedly punished Zimbabwe for righting a wrong that they caused, or at the very least perpetuated. Let's get one thing clear. These sanctions have never been about fighting corruption or human rights abuses or even Robert Mugabe. These sanctions have been about crippling or trying to cripple an African country that has dared to stand up against them. Until next time, this was The Take. And if you have not done so, it would mean the world for me if you could subscribe to this channel and like and share this content if you find it inspiring. This will ensure that you do not miss any content and videos that I share on this channel. Thank you for joining us. This was The Take.